John 1:14 says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." As we await Christ's second coming, I think it's important to look back at his first coming. Whether you celebrate Christmas or not, we all need to reflect on the question, why did God have to come to earth? Let's break down verse 14 of John chapter 1 today. The Word became flesh. While Christ as God was uncreated and eternal, the Word became emphasizes Christ taking on humanity. This reality is surely the most profound ever, because it indicates that the infinite became finite. The eternal was conformed to time. The invisible became visible. The supernatural one reduced himself to the natural. In the incarnation, however, the Word did not cease to be God, but became God in human flesh, which is undiminished deity in human form as a man. It says that God became flesh and dwelt among us. Dwelt meaning to pitch a tabernacle or live in a tent. The term recalls to mind the Old Testament tabernacle where God met with Israel before the temple was constructed, Exodus 25 verse 8. It was called the tabernacle of meeting, the tabernacle of witness, where the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. In the New Testament, God chose to dwell among his people in a far more personal way through becoming a man. In the Old Testament, when the tabernacle was completed, God's Shekinah presence filled the entire structure. When the Word became flesh, the glorious presence of deity was embodied in him. It says, "We beheld his glory." Although his deity may have been veiled in human flesh, glimpses exist in the Gospels of his divine majesty. The disciples saw glimpses of his glory on the Mount of Transfiguration. The reference to Christ's glory, however, was not only visible, but also spiritual. They saw him display the attributes or characteristics of God, like grace, goodness, mercy, wisdom, and truth. Then it says, "He had the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." Jesus as God displayed the same essential glory as the Father. They are one in nature. When we say only begotten, the word does not come from the term meaning beget, but instead has the idea of the only beloved one. It therefore has the idea of uniqueness, of being beloved like no other. By this word, John emphasized the exclusive nature and character of the relationship between the Father and the Son in the Godhead. It does not connotate origin, but rather unique prominence. It was used of Isaac in Hebrews 11 verse 17, who was Abraham's second son. It said that Jesus was full of grace and truth. John probably had Exodus 33 in mind. On that occasion, Moses requested that God display his glory to him. The Lord replied to Moses that he would make all of his goodness pass before him, and then as he passed by God, declared, "The Lord, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abounding in goodness and truth." These attributes of God's glory emphasize the goodness of God's character, especially in relationship to salvation. Jesus as Yahweh of the Old Testament, the great I Am, displayed the same divine attributes when he tabernacled among men in the New Testament era. So we know that Christ came the first time in the fullness of time, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those who are under the law, Galatians 4:4. We answered the question, why did God come to earth the first time? So we also need to reflect on the question, why does God have to come back a second time? God intervened in human history to bring salvation the first time. God will intervene again in order to usher in his 1,000-year millennial kingdom and bring salvation to Israel. Israel rejected Christ the first time, but the second time they will look on me whom they have pierced and turn and be saved. Once again, Christ will be on the earth full of glory. In Zechariah 14, 16 through 19 says this, "And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be that whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, on them there will be no rain. And if the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague with which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of all the nations that do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." So it's interesting, brothers and sisters, that in the millennial kingdom there's an actual curse on those who refuse to go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, why is this? Well, just as Jesus came the first time to tabernacle among men and enclose himself in human flesh, when he comes a second time, he will be God manifest in the flesh in the person of Jesus Christ, ruling and reigning on the earth. And when you refuse to acknowledge that, there will be a special curse, and in this case, no rain on the nations that refuse to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. Second time, when he is ruling and reigning on earth, there will be immediate punishment for refusing to acknowledge Jesus Christ as God manifest in the flesh. So as we approach the season of Christmas, let's look back at his first coming and realize that the Word became flesh, he dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory. And we will once again behold God's glory again in his second coming. Maranatha.